I am Bill Dalton, 69 years old, and I raised my daughter with my own sweat and tears. Yet at her wedding reception, her new father-in-law threw a glass of ice water directly into my face in front of 900 high society guests. The massive ballroom fell dead silent. I slowly stood up, wiped the freezing water from my eyes, looked the man dead in his face and said, "Do you really know who you just insulted?" In a single second, his smug smile completely vanished. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who severely underestimated your worth. I was seated at table 84. It was tucked away in a dark corner of the grand ballroom, right next to the swinging kitchen doors. Every time a waiter rushed out with a silver tray, the heavy wooden door would bump against the back of my chair. I did not complain. I just sat quietly and watched my daughter Sarah glowing in her custom silk gown, dancing under a chandelier that looked like it was made of crushed diamonds. I wore a rented tuxedo that was a little too tight around the shoulders. My hands, rough and calloused from decades of what they thought was simple blue-collar labor, rested on the cheap white tablecloth. The rest of the tables were draped in imported silk, but apparently the father of the bride did not qualify for the upgrade. Then the heavy scent of $100 scotch and expensive cologne hit me before he even spoke. Richard Kensington, the father of the groom. He stood over my table, swaying slightly, looking down at me as if I were a stain on the polished marble floor. He did not offer his hand. He just sneered at the frayed cuffs of my rented jacket. Dalton, Richard said, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. "What are you still doing here? The dinner service is over. We are about to begin the VIP corporate photographs for the financial press." I looked up at him calmly. "I am waiting for the father-daughter dance, Richard. It is customary for the father of the bride to stay until the end of the wedding." Richard let out a harsh, barking laugh that drew the attention of the surrounding high society tables. The father of the bride, he mocked loudly, making sure his wealthy friends could hear. "Look around you, old man. Look at the executives, the politicians, the real estate moguls in this room. You are a retired nobody in a cheap suit. You are ruining the aesthetic of my family's legacy just by breathing the air in this room. I want you out before the photographers turn their lenses this way." I felt a slow, steady burn in my chest. He was talking about the legacy of a room that I had practically financed. Through the grueling years of what Sarah thought was my modest construction job, I had paid for her entire Ivy League college tuition in cash. Just yesterday, when Sarah called me crying that Richard refused to cover the $50,000 floral arrangement because it was out of his strict budget, I had quietly written the check to the florist so my daughter could have her dream. The very orchids Richard was standing next to were paid for by my calloused hands. Before I could explain this to him, I saw Sarah approaching. My heart lifted. My daughter was coming to intervene. She gathered her massive white skirt and hurried over to our dark corner. I gave her a reassuring smile, expecting her to tell her new father-in-law to back off. Instead, she leaned down, refusing to make eye contact with me. "Dad, please just go," Sarah whispered, her voice tight with embarrassment. "You are making Richard uncomfortable, and Brad is getting upset. Just take a cab home." The words hit me harder than a physical blow. I stared at my only child, the girl I had raised entirely on my own since she was a toddler after her mother passed away. I remembered the nights I stayed up helping her with math homework, the weekends I sacrificed to afford her private tutoring. And now she was asking me to leave her wedding because my mere presence was a social inconvenience to her new wealthy family. "I am not leaving, Sarah," I said, keeping my voice low but incredibly firm. "I am your father. I have every right to be here." Richard slammed his heavy hand onto my table, making the silverware violently clatter. "You have no rights here, you pathetic old fool," Richard snarled, his face turning an angry shade of red. "You contributed nothing to this union, My son is elevating your daughter from the dirt she came from. You will leave this property right now, or I will have my private security drag you out through the service elevator." I stood up. I am exactly 5 inches taller than Richard, and despite my age, my shoulders are broad from a lifetime of fierce discipline. I did not raise my voice, but the steel in my tone was unmistakable. "You will not touch me, Richard, and you will not speak to me like that ever again." Richard's eyes went wide with fury. A man accustomed to absolute obedience does not handle defiance well, especially from someone he views as a peasant. In a split second of blind, arrogant rage, he reached over to the neighboring table, grabbed a heavy crystal glass full of ice water, and hurled the freezing contents directly into my face. The crack of the ice hitting my cheekbone echoed through the immediate area. The freezing water soaked my hairs, dripping down the collar of my rented shirt and staining the cheap fabric of my jacket. The jazz band abruptly stopped playing. The sudden silence in the grand ballroom was deafening. 900 high society guests turned their heads to stare at the dripping, humiliated old man in the corner. I stood perfectly still. The ice water stung my eyes, but I did not blink. I looked past Richard and looked directly at Sarah. My daughter, my own flesh and blood, slowly turned her back to me. She walked away, disappearing into the crowd of whispering executives. She left me there. The betrayal severed something deep inside my chest. The agonizing pain of a father's broken heart instantly calcified into something cold, hard, and entirely devoid of mercy. I slowly wiped the freezing water from my eyes with the back of my rough hand. I looked Richard Kensington dead in his eyes. His chest was heaving with arrogant satisfaction. "Do you really know who you just insulted?" I asked softly, the words slicing through the absolute silence of the room. Richard smirked, though a flicker of profound uncertainty flashed in his eyes. "Just a broke old man who does not know his place." I did not argue. I simply turned around and walked out of the ballroom. I walked with my back perfectly straight, ignoring the hundreds of mocking stares burning into my spine. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the luxury hotel and stepped out into the humid night air. The valet brought around my rusted 2004 pickup truck. It looked completely absurd, parked next to the line of foreign sports cars and luxury sedans. I climbed into the torn leather driver's seat and put the key in the ignition. Just as the engine sputtered to life, my cell phone buzzed violently in my pocket. I pulled it out, expecting a belated, desperate apology text from Sarah. Instead, it was an automated banking alert from my civilian everyday checking account. The screen lit up the dark cabin of my truck. Insufficient funds. I stared at the glowing letters. That account held the entirety of what Sarah believed to be my meager life savings. $100,000. It was the money she thought I was living on for the rest of my days. I clicked on the alert. The transaction details loaded slowly over the cellular network. A $100,000 wire transfer to Bradley Kensington, initiated by Sarah Dalton. They did not just insult me. They did not just humiliate me in front of 900 people. They were currently robbing me blind. The sting of the ice water on my face was absolutely nothing compared to the freezing reality of what my daughter had just done. She had drained her own father's survival fund to hand it over to the family that had just thrown me out like garbage. I drove back to my small, modest house in total silence. I did not turn on the radio. I did not turn on the heater, despite the damp chill clinging to my soaked clothes. I pulled into the cracked concrete driveway, walked up the creaking wooden steps, and unlocked the front door. The house was completely dark. I did not bother turning on the main lights. I walked straight into the small, outdated kitchen and sat down at the scratched dining table. The only illumination came from the street lamp outside, casting long, distorted shadows across the linoleum floor. I opened my old laptop and logged directly into the bank's main portal. My eyes scanned the digital ledger. The balance sat at a mocking $0.00. I pulled up the digitized image of the wire transfer authorization form. There it was, my signature. Or rather, a flawless forgery of my signature. Sarah and I had set up this joint account years ago when she was in college just in case of an emergency. She knew exactly how to replicate my handwriting. She knew exactly the security questions to bypass the fraud department over the phone. She had used the money to pay off Bradley's hidden debts. I knew Bradley had severe financial troubles. I had noticed the late notices accidentally left on their counter, the hushed, panicked phone calls he took during family dinners, the nervous sweat on his brow whenever money was mentioned. But I never imagined my own daughter would steal my supposed life savings to bail out a man whose family openly bragged about possessing millions. Or so they claimed. A normal father would have broken down. A normal 69-year-old man who just lost his entire retirement fund would have called the police in a panic, crying about the ultimate familial betrayal. I did not cry. I did not panic. I felt a strange, terrifying calm wash over my entire body. The man who had raised Sarah, the patient, endlessly forgiving father, who wore cheap flannel and drove a rusted truck, died right there at that kitchen table. I pushed my chair back and walked into my small, dusty home office. I moved the heavy oak bookshelf aside, revealing a small patch of faded carpet. I pulled the carpet back to expose a heavy steel floor safe embedded deeply in the concrete foundation. I spun the dial. 32. Left 14. Right 58. The heavy metal door clicked open. Inside there was no cash. Oh, there were no sentimental photographs. There was only a single sleek black encrypted burner phone and a thick leather-bound dossier. I picked up the phone. I had not turned it on in 5 long years. I pressed the power button and waited for the highly secure network to connect. I punched in a number that only one other person in the world possessed. It rang exactly once before a crisp, sharp voice answered. "Dalton," the voice said. It was Jonathan Reed, my corporate estate attorney, a man known in the financial underworld as an absolute shark, a man who destroyed multinational conglomerates before his morning coffee. "Jonathan," I said, my voice steady and devoid of all emotion. "It is time." There was a brief pause on the line. "Are you certain, Bill? You have kept the civilian facade up for a decade. If we do this, the camouflage is completely gone." I looked down at my soaked, cheap rented tuxedo. The camouflage was a catastrophic mistake, Jonathan. I wanted my daughter to learn the value of hard work. I wanted her to stay grounded. Instead, she grew up ashamed of me. She married into a family of arrogant parasites, and tonight she helped them steal what she thinks is my last dime. "What are your orders?" Jonathan asked, his tone shifting immediately into pure predatory business. "Unseal the Apex Holdings Trust," I commanded. "Understood." "And the target?" "Richard Kensington thinks he is a king," I said, staring at the blank wall of my dark office. "He thinks he sits on an impenetrable throne of wealth and legacy. He just threw ice water in the face of the man he believes is a broke, pathetic mechanic. It is time to show him who actually owns the castle." The elevator doors slid open on the 50th floor of the towering glass skyscraper. The reception area of Reed and Associates was entirely white marble and brushed steel. It was a cold and sterile environment designed specifically to intimidate anyone who stepped off the elevator. I walked past the receptionist without stopping. She knew better than to ask for my name. Jonathan Reed was waiting for me in the main boardroom at the absolute end of the long corridor. The room was surrounded by floor-to-ceiling glass windows that overlooked the entire sprawling city skyline. Jonathan stood at the head of a massive mahogany conference table. He was dressed in a pristine charcoal suit, and his silver hair was perfectly combed. Laid out symmetrically across the polished wood were 6 thick manila folders. I sat down heavily in one of the oversized leather chairs. I had not slept a single minute. I was still wearing the same clothes from the night before. I had taken off the ruined tuxedo jacket, but I still wore the cheap white button-down shirt, the collar wrinkled and slightly damp from the ice water. Jonathan looked at my rough appearance, then looked down at the organized folders. He pushed the first heavy folder across the smooth surface of the table. "I told you to wait," Bill, Jonathan said quietly. "I told you years ago that living like a ghost in your own financial empire was a dangerous and foolish game." I opened the folder slowly. "I do not pay you for life advice, Jonathan," I replied, staring at the pages filled with dense corporate financial data. "Just give me the anatomy of the enemy. Tell me exactly what Richard Kensington is made of." Jonathan tapped the open page with his expensive gold pen. "He is made entirely of smoke and mirrors, Bill. Richard Kensington projects the image of an untouchable titan of industry. He throws million-dollar weddings, he wears bespoke suits, and he drives imported luxury vehicles. But his logistics company is completely hemorrhaging money. Kensington Global is surviving entirely on high-interest corporate loans and aggressively overdrawn credit lines. They have lost 3 major international shipping contracts in the last 2 quarters alone because Richard has been siphoning corporate funds to maintain his lavish personal lifestyle. They are exactly 6 months away from total and absolute insolvency." I turned the page, studying the red ink that stained Richard's balance sheets. "So he is a complete fraud," I stated calmly. "A proud man standing on a rotting wooden floor, pretending it is solid concrete." "Exactly," Jonathan agreed. "But Richard has one saving grace left. His company's stock price is entirely tied to the public perception of stability. And that perception is anchored by their massive 40-story corporate headquarters downtown. As long as they occupy that premium commercial real estate, their investors and board members believe they are untouchable. Richard is currently negotiating a 10-year lease renewal for that exact building. If he secures that lease, he can leverage the property agreement to secure a massive bailout loan from a private equity firm. It is his absolute last lifeline." I looked up from the folder and met Jonathan's eyes. I felt the cold, hard knot in my chest tighten as a profound realization began to dawn on me. "And who exactly owns that building, Jonathan?" Jonathan allowed a razor-thin, predatory smile to cross his face. "Apex Holdings. You bought that property through a subsidiary shell corporation 7 years ago. Richard Kensington has been writing his massive corporate rent checks directly into your bank account for nearly a decade. He has absolutely no idea that the man he humiliated and threw out of his son's wedding is the supreme landlord of his entire fraudulent empire." I closed the folder and rested my calloused hands on the cover. The irony was suffocating. I owned the very ground Richard Kensington walked on, yet he had treated me like dirt on his shoe. Jonathan leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. He looked at me with a rare expression of genuine sympathy. "Bill, I have managed your immense wealth for 20 years. I watched you build Apex Holdings from a single concrete mixing truck into a billion-dollar commercial real estate empire. Why did you never tell Sarah the truth? Why did you let her grow up thinking you were just a struggling blue-collar worker scraping by on a meager pension? If she knew the truth about her inheritance, she never would have looked for financial security in a family of parasites like the Kensingtons." I stood up slowly and walked over to the massive glass window. I looked down at the tiny cars moving through the city streets far below. My chest felt incredibly heavy, burdened by years of silent, agonizing choices. "Because of her mother," I said softly, my voice barely more than a rough whisper against the glass. "When my wife Mary died of cancer, Sarah was only 7 years old. We had absolutely nothing back then. I worked 14-hour shifts just to keep the heat on in our tiny apartment. Mary and I promised each other on her deathbed that we would raise a daughter who understood the profound value of a dollar. We wanted a daughter who respected hard work and possessed genuine moral character." I turned back to face Jonathan, the memories flooding my mind. As my business grew, as the millions started pouring into the trust accounts, I saw what sudden wealth did to my business colleagues. It ruined their children completely. It turned them into entitled, arrogant monsters who believed the world owed them everything without lifting a finger. I was absolutely terrified of losing Sarah to that toxic lifestyle. I wanted her to build her own life, to find a man who loved her for her mind and her spirit, not for her father's massive bank account. So I hid the empire. I put the money in blind trusts. I kept driving my rusty truck, and I stayed in our small suburban house. I thought I was protecting her soul. Jonathan shook his head slowly, and instead, it backfired completely. Yes, I admitted the bitter taste of utter failure coating my mouth. It backfired in the worst possible way. She resented our daily struggle. She became deeply ashamed of my simple life and my worn-out clothes. She became so desperate to escape what she perceived as poverty that she threw herself at the first flashy, arrogant family that offered her a seat at their exclusive country club. I tried to teach her humility, and instead I accidentally taught her to worship greed. Jonathan opened the final folder and pushed it slowly toward the center of the mahogany table. "Then let me show you the true devastating cost of that greed," he said, his voice dropping to a serious, hushed tone. "Let us talk about your new son-in-law. Let us talk about Bradley Kensington and the $100,000 your daughter stole from you last night." I walked back to the table and looked closely at the documents. It was a complete digital trace of the wire transfer Sarah had fraudulently initiated using my forged signature. "Bradley is not just bad at managing his personal finances," Jonathan explained. "He has a severe and uncontrollable gambling addiction. But he does not play at licensed casinos where he can simply declare bankruptcy and walk away. He plays in underground high-stakes poker rooms run by some very dangerous people." Jonathan pointed to a specific offshore routing number, highlighted in bright yellow on the page. That $100,000 did not go to a domestic bank to pay off a mortgage or a luxury car loan. It was wired directly to an untraceable offshore account, controlled by a notorious loan shark syndicate, operating out of Macau. Sarah stole your supposed life savings to keep men with weapons from showing up at her new suburban mansion. I stared intently at the offshore account number. My own daughter had committed federal wire fraud to pay off violent international criminals. And here is the absolute hook. Jonathan continued, his eyes locking onto mine with fierce intensity. That $100,000 was just a good faith payment to keep them from breaking his legs. Bradley still owes the syndicate $500,000. He is drowning Bill. The syndicate is calling in the entire debt by the end of the month. The Kensington family is completely out of liquid cash, and Richard refuses to liquidate his failing company's remaining assets to save his son from the streets. Bradley is utterly desperate, and Sarah is now legally tied to his fraudulent financial maneuvers. The entire picture suddenly snapped into perfect, terrifying focus. Richard was a corporate fraud on the verge of total collapse, desperately needing my building to survive. Bradley was a crippling gambling addict with $500,000 in violent street debt. And Sarah, my beautiful, misguided daughter, was the financial anchor they were using to drag themselves out of the abyss. Jonathan closed the thick folder. "We can crush Richard's lease renewal with a single phone call right now, Bill. We can evict Kensington Global in 30 days and watch his stock drop to zero. But if we pull the pin on this grenade, Bradley goes down hard, and he will undoubtedly drag Sarah down with him to save himself. The federal fraud charges alone could put her in prison for a decade." "What do you want to do?" I stood in the sterile, quiet boardroom. I thought about the freezing ice water hitting my face. I thought about the deafening, mocking silence of the wedding guests. I thought about the back of Sarah's custom silk wedding dress as she walked away from me, abandoning her devoted father to the wolves, just to save face with her abusers. "I want you to buy Bradley's debt," I said, my voice completely stripped of any remaining fatherly warmth or hesitation. "Contact the syndicate in Macau immediately. Offer them a 10% premium on the $500,000. I want Apex Holdings to legally own Bradley Kensington's life." Jonathan nodded slowly, a dark and absolute understanding passing between us. And the building lease for Richard. Deny the renewal I commanded. But do not tell them yet. Let Richard print the expensive invitations for his corporate victory gala. Let him stand on the stage and smile for the cameras. Then we cut the floor out from under him in front of everyone. Let us buy the noose, Jonathan. They are going to hang themselves. I drove my rusted 2004 pickup truck through the towering wrought iron gates of the Kensington estate. The sprawling manicured lawns and the massive stone facade of the mansion were designed to project an image of absolute and untouchable wealth. Just a few hours ago, I would have looked at this house and felt a deep pang of inadequacy. I would have felt like the failure they all claimed I was. Now I looked at the imported marble fountains and the perfectly trimmed hedges and only saw a decaying facade. I knew it was all held together by high-interest loans and desperate lies. I parked my truck directly behind a brand-new imported sports car. I turned off the engine and picked up a dusty cardboard box from the passenger seat. Inside the box were Sarah's childhood photo albums. There were pictures of her missing her front teeth, pictures of her high school graduation, and pictures of us eating cheap ice cream on the porch of our small house. It was the perfect camouflage for my visit. A defeated and heartbroken old man bringing sentimental memories to the daughter who had violently discarded him. I walked up the wide stone steps and pressed the glowing doorbell. The heavy oak door swung open after a few moments. Richard Kensington stood there wearing a tailored silk robe and holding a crystal glass of expensive morning bourbon. His eyes immediately narrowed with absolute disgust when he saw my worn flannel shirt and my scuffed work boots standing on his pristine porch. He did not step aside to invite me inside. "What do you want, Dalton?" Richard demanded, his voice echoing in the grand marble foyer. "I told you last night that you are no longer welcome anywhere near my family. You caused enough of a scene at the wedding." I lowered my head and let my shoulders slump forward. I played the role of the broken father to absolute perfection. "I just brought Sarah's childhood photo albums," I said softly, making sure my voice trembled just a little bit. "I know she does not want to see me today, but I thought she might want these for her new house. She left them in my attic." Richard sneered and finally stepped aside, gesturing lazily toward the formal living room down the hall. "Leave them on the coffee table and get out," he ordered. "Do not touch anything on your way out." I walked slowly into the cavernous living room. The ceiling was vaulted, and a massive crystal chandelier hung over a custom Italian leather sofa. Bradley was lounging on that sofa. He was wearing pristine designer golf clothes, preparing for a morning at the country club. But my eyes immediately locked onto his left wrist. Gleaming in the morning sunlight streaming through the massive windows was a brand-new, solid gold luxury watch. I knew luxury timepieces well enough from my years running Apex Holdings to recognize a $40,000 watch. It was bought and paid for with the money my own daughter had stolen from me just 12 hours prior. Before I walked through the front door, I had activated the high-definition audio recorder on the encrypted burner phone tucked securely in my breast pocket. The device was capturing every single sound in the room. I placed the cardboard box on the glass table and looked directly at Bradley. "That is a very beautiful watch, Bradley," I said, keeping my posture weak and submissive. "Did you buy that with the $100,000 you and Sarah took from my bank account last night?" Bradley laughed out loud. It was a cruel and echoing sound that bounced off the high walls of the empty mansion. He stood up and walked over to me shamelessly, admiring the heavy gold watch on his wrist. He did not show an ounce of guilt or fear. "It is a wedding gift to myself," Old Man Bradley said with absolute arrogance. "And you should consider it an investment in your daughter's future. She belongs to the Kensington family now, which means your pathetic life savings finally served a real purpose. You were just going to rot in that tiny house anyway." I looked down at the floor, forcing myself to swallow the intense rage building in my chest. "Sarah forged my signature." "Bradley," I said quietly, "that is federal wire fraud. Why did you make her do that to her own father? Why did you steal everything I had left in the world? Bradley poured himself a drink from the crystal decanter on the side table, completely relaxed. I did not make her do anything, Dalton Bradley bragged, taking a sip of his drink. Sarah is a smart girl. She knew I had some aggressive creditors breathing down my neck because of a few bad investments. She knew my father has his immense wealth temporarily tied up in corporate assets right now. So she suggested we use your little emergency fund to clear the air. We did some creative accounting. She signed the withdrawal slip, and the money vanished into an offshore account. You are never seeing a single dime of it again, so I suggest you go back to your miserable little house and forget you ever had a daughter. Richard walked into the living room and pointed a stern finger toward the front door. You heard my son, Dalton. Your money is gone, and quite frankly, you owed it to us for taking your daughter off your hands. You are completely irrelevant to us now. Leave the photo albums and get off my property before I call the local police and have you arrested for trespassing. I nodded slowly, maintaining the flawless illusion of total defeat. I turned around and began to walk toward the grand entryway, letting my boots drag heavily against the floor. But as I walked down the hallway, I passed Richard's massive mahogany study. The heavy wooden door had been left slightly ajar. I glanced inside as I walked by. Spread out across his pristine leather desk were 3 thick stacks of legal paper. The top sheets bore bright red urgent stamps from a major national banking institution. Even from a few feet away, my trained eyes could clearly read the bold black letters printed across the top of the documents. Notice of default and intent to foreclose. Final warning. I kept walking without changing my pace or looking back. Jonathan was absolutely right. The Kensington family was entirely out of money. They were heavily faking their wealth to keep up social appearances, standing blindly on the edge of a massive financial cliff. They lived in a mansion they did not own, ran a company that was bleeding cash, and bought luxury watches with stolen money just to pretend they were still royalty. And Bradley had just willingly confessed on a crystal-clear audio recording to committing federal wire fraud, explicitly implicating my daughter as the mastermind of the theft. I walked out of the heavy oak doors and climbed back into my rusted truck. I started the engine and drove back through the towering iron gates. I did not feel defeated anymore. I felt like a judge who had just been handed a signed confession. The Kensingtons thought they had just crushed a helpless old man. They had absolutely no idea that the man they just robbed was the very same man who held the absolute power to legally erase their entire existence. I sat in the heavy leather chair in Jonathan's private office, while the city lights began to flicker on outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. We had been working for 6 straight hours, building the financial guillotine that would execute the Kensington family. I drank black coffee from a paper cup and listened as Jonathan laid out the intricate web of shell companies we were going to use. I wanted total anonymity. When the trap finally sprang shut, I wanted Richard and Bradley to realize that their destruction came from the very man they thought was beneath their notice. Jonathan typed rapidly on his sleek laptop. I am setting up 3 separate holding corporations, he explained, his eyes never leaving the screen. We will use a firm in Delaware to purchase Richard's corporate debt, a proxy group in London to acquire his outstanding commercial credit lines, and we will route the acquisition of Bradley's offshore gambling markers through a private equity shell in the Cayman Islands. By the time they realize all their debt is suddenly owned by a single entity, the jaws of the trap will already be locked tightly around their throats. I nodded slowly. Do it, I said. I want to own every single dollar they owe to the world. I want to own the paper on the cars they drive, the house they sleep in, and the very air they breathe inside that fraudulent company. Jonathan picked up his secure phone and began making the calls. For the first 30 minutes, everything proceeded with absolute surgical precision. The offshore syndicate holding Bradley's gambling debt was more than happy to sell the markers for a 10% premium. Violent criminals prefer clean cash over breaking legs, Jonathan noted, as he finalized the wire transfer. We now owned Bradley's life, But then Jonathan's fingers suddenly stopped moving across his keyboard. A deep frown creased his forehead. He stared at a flashing red alert on his private terminal. "We have a major problem, Bill," Jonathan said, his voice tightening with unexpected stress. "Someone else is moving on Richard's corporate debt." I sat forward. "Explain exactly what you mean," I demanded. "It is a vulture capital firm out of New York called Vanguard Acquisitions," Jonathan said rapidly, pulling up new data on the screen. "They specialize in finding dying logistics. Companies buying up their toxic debt for pennies on the dollar and then ruthlessly liquidating the assets. They just submitted a massive bulk offer to the primary bank holding Richard's commercial loans. They are trying to buy the entire debt portfolio." My chest tightened. If Vanguard buys that debt, what happens to Richard? I asked. Jonathan looked at me grimly. "Vanguard will strip his company down for parts by the end of the week. They will fire everyone, sell the trucks, and force Richard into standard corporate bankruptcy. He will lose the company, yes, but he will be legally shielded from personal ruin. Vanguard does not care about justice or vengeance. They just want a quick profit. If they win this bid, Richard escapes the public humiliation you have planned. He gets to play the tragic victim of a hostile corporate takeover. He will never know you were the one who held the power." I felt a surge of cold anger. Richard Kensington was not going to escape into the comfort of a standard bankruptcy. He was not going to get a quiet exit. He had publicly humiliated me. His son had manipulated my daughter into stealing my life savings. I was not going to let a faceless New York firm steal my execution. Counter their bid, I ordered, my voice dropping to a dangerously low pitch. Jonathan hesitated. Bill, Vanguard offered $12 million for the debt portfolio. The portfolio itself is barely worth $8 million in actual recoverable assets. If we outbid them, you will be intentionally losing millions of dollars just to secure the rights to destroy this man. It is a terrible financial move." I looked at the brilliant city skyline. I remembered the freezing shock of the ice water hitting my face. I remembered the absolute silence of the 900 guests. I remembered the agonizing sight of Sarah turning her back on me. "I did not build a billion-dollar empire to worry about a few $1,000,000, Jonathan," I said smoothly. "I built it so I would never have to bow to men like Richard Kensington. Offer $15 million right now." Jonathan swallowed hard, realizing the absolute depths of my resolve. He nodded once, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he drafted the counteroffer. He submitted the bid directly to the primary bank. The room fell completely silent. The only sound was the low hum of the air conditioning. We waited. 5 minutes felt like 5 agonizing years. If Vanguard countered again, we would be locked in a blind bidding war that could draw unwanted media attention and expose my identity too early. Then Jonathan's phone rang. He picked it up, listened for 10 seconds, and hung up. He let out a long breath and leaned back in his chair. "The bank accepted our offer," Jonathan said, a faint smile touching the corners of his mouth. "Vanguard backed down. The premium was too high for their profit margins. It is done, Bill. The Delaware Shell Company now officially holds every single note of Richard Kensington's corporate debt. You own the company. You own his son. You hold all the cards." I stood up from the leather chair. "Keep the transfer absolutely quiet," I instructed. "I do not want Richard to know his loans have been sold until I am standing directly in front of him." I left the high-rise building and drove my rusted truck back to my quiet, dark neighborhood. The sheer weight of what I had just accomplished settled heavily on my shoulders. I held the absolute power to wipe an entire wealthy family off the map. It was a terrifying amount of control, but my conscience was completely clear. They had dug this grave with their own overwhelming arrogance and endless greed. I was simply the man buying the dirt to bury them. The next morning, the sun rose over my small suburban house, casting a warm light over the cracked driveway. I walked out to the rusted mailbox at the end of the street. Inside, amidst the grocery flyers and utility bills, was a thick, heavy envelope. It was made of expensive cream-colored paper sealed with a prominent gold wax stamp bearing the Kensington family crest. I walked back into my kitchen, grabbed a small knife, and sliced the heavy envelope open. Inside was a formal, heavily embossed invitation. Richard Kensington, CEO of Kensington Global, cordially invites you to a grand corporate gala celebrating the dawn of a lucrative new merger and the permanent expansion of our legacy. I stared at the golden letters. Richard was throwing a massive party to celebrate the survival of his company. He truly believed he had secured the 10-year lease renewal on the headquarters building. He believed he had convinced his private equity investors that a new merger was going to save them all. He was gathering all the wealthy executives, the politicians, and the high society elite into one room to boast about his untouchable success. But Richard had not sent me this invitation. A man like Richard would never invite the blue-collar father he had just thrown out of a wedding. I turned the heavy card over. Taped to the back of the invitation was a small piece of custom stationery. I immediately recognized the elegant looping handwriting. It was Sarah. I read the handwritten note, and every single word felt like a poisoned needle slipping directly into my heart. Dad, I know you are probably still angry about the wedding and the money, but Bradley and I thought you should see what real success actually looks like. The Kensingtons are closing a deal this weekend that will secure our family for generations. This is the world I belong in now. A world of real power, not just struggling to pay the heating bill every winter. I sent you this invitation so you can come and see for yourself. Maybe if you see what Richard has built, you will finally understand why I had to leave your small life behind. Do not wear the rented tuxedo if you decide to show up. I placed the note gently on the kitchen counter. I did not feel the sting of betrayal anymore. That part of me was already dead and buried. My own daughter had stolen my survival money to pay off her husband's gambling debts, and now she was cruelly mocking my perceived poverty. She was using her new father-in-law's fake success as a weapon to make me feel small. She wanted me to stand in the back of another grand ballroom and watch them celebrate their stolen fraudulent wealth. I picked up the heavy gold invitation and slid it carefully into the breast pocket of my flannel shirt. I am going to attend your party, Sarah, I whispered to the empty room. I am going to walk into that ballroom, and I am going to show you and your new family what real power actually looks like. You wanted to leave my small life behind to join an empire. I am going to make sure you have absolutely front-row seats when I burn that empire to the ground. I returned to Jonathan's high-rise office on Thursday morning. The sky outside the floor-to-ceiling windows was a heavy overcast gray. It perfectly matched the cold and clinical atmosphere inside the boardroom. Laid out across the polished mahogany table were dozens of thick legal documents. They were neatly organized into separate stacks, each one representing a different structural pillar of the Kensington family empire. I sat down in the heavy leather chair and picked up the solid gold pen Jonathan had placed next to the paperwork. This was the moment of execution. I pulled the first stack toward me. These were the commercial eviction notices for Kensington Global. By signing my name on the dotted line, I was legally authorizing the immediate termination of Richard's 40-story corporate headquarters lease. I was ordering the locks to be changed and the property to be seized. I signed the bottom of the page without a single ounce of hesitation. I moved on to the second stack of papers. These were the aggressive debt call-ins for Richard's logistics company. I was demanding the immediate repayment of the $15 million in corporate loans I had purchased through my Delaware shell company. I was stripping away his safety net and exposing his massive fraud to the banking sector. I signed those pages with a steady hand. My signature felt like a loaded weapon. I reached for the third and final stack of documents. This was the paperwork regarding Bradley's $500,000 offshore gambling debt. This was the absolute kill shot. But before the tip of my pen could touch the heavy paper, Jonathan reached out and placed his hand firmly over the documents. I looked up at him. His face was entirely serious, stripped of his usual predatory courtroom confidence. "We need to have a very clear conversation before you sign those specific papers," Bill Jonathan said quietly. "You need to understand the absolute legal reality of what happens the second I file these documents with the federal authorities." I leaned back in my chair and looked at my lawyer. "Tell me," I commanded. "If we aggressively call in Bradley's gambling debt," Jonathan explained, "we are legally forcing a comprehensive financial audit of his recent transactions to verify his lack of liquid assets. The banking authorities will automatically trace the money he already paid to the international syndicate. That digital trace will lead directly back to the $100,000 wire transfer from your civilian joint bank account." "I know that, Jonathan," I replied smoothly. "That is the entire point. I want Bradley exposed for the thief and the fraud that he is." Jonathan shook his head slowly, removing his hand from the paperwork. "You are missing the collateral damage, Bill. Bradley did not walk into your bank and forge your signature. Sarah did. Her name is on the withdrawal slip. Her face is on the branch security cameras. When the federal financial investigators look into this wire fraud, they are not just going to arrest Bradley. They are going to indict Sarah. She actively facilitated the transfer of stolen funds to an international criminal syndicate to cover her husband's illicit debts. If you sign those papers, you are handing your only daughter over to the federal justice system. She could face up to 10 years in a federal penitentiary for massive wire fraud." The silence in the grand boardroom was absolute. Jonathan's words hung in the cold air, pressing down on my chest with the crushing weight of a freight train. I stared at the blank signature line on the paper. For a brief, agonizing moment, the cold shell around my heart cracked. I saw Sarah as a little girl riding a bright red bicycle in our cracked concrete driveway. I remembered her holding my hand tightly when we stood in the pouring rain and buried her mother. I remembered working late into the night, my bones aching from physical labor, just so she could have a beautiful new dress for her high school prom. She was my blood. She was my only child. She was the only family I had left in this entire world. A normal father would stop right there. A normal father would absorb the devastating financial loss, burn the legal documents, and try to protect his daughter from the horrific consequences of her own terrible choices. A normal father would let the arrogant Kensingtons win just to keep his little girl out of a concrete prison cell. But then I remembered the freezing shock of the ice water hitting my face at the wedding reception. I remembered looking into Sarah's eyes, desperately waiting for her to defend me, only to watch her turn her back and walk away into the crowd of laughing executives. I remembered her standing by while Richard treated me like garbage. I remembered the cruel mocking note she had written on the back of the gala invitation, telling me that my life was small and pathetic, and that her new family was true royalty. She had not been coerced into stealing my money. She had bragged about it to Bradley. She had chosen her path. She had chosen toxic greed over familial loyalty, blinding arrogance over unconditional love, and a family of parasitic frauds over the father who had sacrificed his entire life for her well-being. I looked Jonathan directly in the eyes. I felt the last remaining shred of my paternal mercy completely wither and die. "She made her bed, Jonathan," I said, my voice as hard and cold as steel. "Let her sleep in it." I pulled my arm free, pressed the gold pen to the heavy paper, and signed my absolute legal name at the bottom of the document. I did not let my hand shake. I pushed the final stack of papers across the mahogany table. The legal web was now entirely complete. There was absolutely no escape for any of them. "File them all," Jonathan the Fry ordered as I stood up from the leather chair. "But time the delivery perfectly. I want the federal marshals and the corporate eviction teams to hit them exactly when Richard takes the stage at his grand corporate gala this Saturday night. I want the entire high society world to watch them fall from grace in real time." Jonathan gathered the documents and placed them carefully into his secure leather briefcase. "Consider it done, Bill. By Sunday morning, The Kensington family will not even have the money to buy a cup of black coffee. I left the office and walked out into the busy city streets. I felt a strange sense of total liberation. I was no longer a victim trapped in their web of abuse. I was the architect of their absolute ruin. I climbed into my rusted pickup truck and started the long drive back to my quiet suburban neighborhood. I was halfway home driving down the interstate when my secure cell phone began to ring. It was not Jonathan. It was an unknown corporate number. I pulled over to the shoulder of the highway, put the truck in park, and answered the call. "Hello," I said. "Good afternoon, Mr. Dalton," a cheerful professional voice said on the other end of the line. "My name is Representative from First National Bank. I am the senior underwriter for the Premium Mortgage Division. We are calling regarding the final approval for the $4 million luxury estate currently being purchased by your son-in-law, Bradley Kensington, and your daughter, Sarah." I sat perfectly still in the cab of my truck, listening to the low hum of the engine. "Go on," I replied calmly. "Well, sir," the underwriter continued, "Bradley and Sarah listed you as their primary financial guarantor. They provided documentation claiming that you are the sole beneficiary of a massive corporate trust and that your hidden assets are securing their massive mortgage application. We just need to verbally verify your financial standing and your intent to back this massive luxury loan before we release the millions in funds to the property sellers this afternoon." The absolute audacity of it took my breath away for a second. Sarah and Bradley had somehow discovered the existence of my corporate trust. They had actively forged a letter of credit using my name to buy a mansion they could not afford. They were trying to leverage my hidden wealth behind my back to fund their lavish lifestyle, assuming I would simply be too weak to stop them once the papers were signed. They were trying to build their absolute dream life on the foundation of my stolen resources. I gripped the steering wheel tightly. I looked at the rusted dashboard of my old truck and felt a cold, unforgiving smile form on my face. "I am sorry to inform you of this," I said to the underwriter, keeping my voice perfectly steady and clear. "But those documents are entirely fraudulent. I am not backing their luxury mortgage. My daughter and her husband are completely broke. They do not have a single dollar to their name. In fact, they are currently under active federal investigation for severe international wire fraud." There was a sharp gasp on the other end of the line, followed by a frantic shuffling of papers. "Sir," underwriter stammered, his cheerful tone entirely gone, "are you absolutely certain about this information? This will immediately trigger a catastrophic default on their current escrow account. They will lose the house today, and we will be forced to report the forged financial documents to the authorities." "I am absolutely certain," I replied without a single drop of remorse in my soul. "She has nothing. Do your job and cancel the loan immediately." I pressed the button to end the call and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. The trap was no longer just set. It was actively snapping shut, breaking their bones one by one. I stood in the center of the private fitting room at the most exclusive tailor in the entire city. The walls were lined with dark, polished mahogany, and the air smelled heavily of expensive imported wool and rich leather. For the past 2 decades, I had bought all of my clothes from discount department stores. I had intentionally worn frayed collars, faded denim, and scuffed work boots to carefully maintain the illusion of a struggling, working-class father. Today, that pathetic illusion was officially dead. The master tailor, an older Italian gentleman with a soft measuring tape draped around his neck, carefully adjusted the broad shoulders of the bespoke $10,000 suit I was wearing. It was woven from a flawless midnight blue charcoal wool that felt incredibly heavy and powerful. When I looked straight ahead into the massive floor-to-ceiling mirror, I did not see the tired, broken old man who had been publicly humiliated and banished to Table 84. I saw the founder and the absolute ruler of Apex Holdings. I saw a man who possessed the financial firepower to buy and sell the entire Kensington family before his morning coffee. The master tailor took a step back and nodded his head with a look of deep professional respect. "It fits you absolutely perfectly, Mr. Dalton," he said softly, smoothing out a microscopic wrinkle on the lapel. "You look exactly like a man who owns the entire world." I looked at my cold reflection in the glass and slowly adjusted the expensive cuffs. "I do own it," I replied quietly. I took the heavy garment bag home and laid the pristine suit carefully across my bed. Then I walked directly to my closet and began pulling out the past. I grabbed every single worn-out flannel shirt, every pair of grass-stained jeans, and every cheap canvas jacket I owned. I gathered my scuffed work boots and my faded baseball caps. I carried the heavy, pathetic pile out to the cracked concrete patio in my small backyard. I tossed every single item into the large, rusted metal fire pit I usually used to burn fallen leaves in the autumn. I went into the garage, grabbed a large plastic container of chemical lighter fluid, and poured a thick, heavy stream over the mountain of cheap fabric. I struck a single wooden match against the brick wall and tossed it directly into the center of the pit. The flames erupted instantly with a loud whoosh, sending a towering plume of thick black smoke high into the gray afternoon sky. I stood perfectly still on the concrete and watched my entire civilian identity turn to black ash. As the heat washed over my face, I realized that my decades of extreme personal sacrifice had been completely pointless. I had intentionally made myself small, hoping it would teach my daughter to be humble and grounded. Instead, my smallness had only given her and her arrogant new family a convenient excuse to step all over me. I watched the frayed collar of my favorite red flannel shirt curl up and completely blacken in the raging fire. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold and brilliant clarity. The weak, forgiving father was burning away, leaving only the ruthless executioner behind. As the aggressive fire began to die down into a bed of glowing red embers, my secure cell phone buzzed violently in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing digital screen. It was a text message from Sarah. It was the very first time she had reached out to me since she turned her back on me and walked away at the wedding reception. I opened the message expecting perhaps a shred of panicked remorse or at least a frantic question about why her massive luxury mansion mortgage had been suddenly completely denied by the bank. Instead, I read a message so dripping with absolute delusion and sickening entitlement that it almost made me laugh out loud. "Dad," the message read, "you completely ruined the elegant aesthetic of our VIP wedding photos with your dramatic little stunt last night. Richard is still furious, and Bradley is under a massive amount of stress because of your embarrassing public behavior. We decided we desperately need to get away from all this toxic, negative energy. We are booking a first-class honeymoon trip to a luxury resort in Dubai. Since you ruined our special day, the absolute least you can do is pay for the first-class flights and the private villa. Wire $50,000 to my new joint account by tonight. Consider it your formal apology to the Kensington family." I stood alone in my quiet backyard and read her impossible words over and over again. My own flesh and blood, who had just committed massive federal wire fraud to steal my supposed life savings, was now demanding an additional $50,000 to fund an exotic luxury vacation. She actually believed she held the absolute moral high ground. She truly believed that I owed her a massive financial apology for having a glass of freezing ice water violently thrown into my face. The sheer blinding magnitude of her greed was totally staggering. She was standing proudly on the deck of a rapidly sinking ship, demanding that I purchase a more expensive deck chair for her to lounge in. She no longer considered herself a Dalton. She explicitly called herself a Kensington. I did not type out a long, emotionally exhausted response. I did not threaten her with the federal police or mention the forged bank documents. I simply typed a single devastating sentence. "Enjoy the weekend, Sarah, because it is the absolute last one you will ever be able to afford." I pressed the send button and watched the message turn green. Then I opened my phone settings and permanently blocked her personal number. I blocked her social media accounts and her email address. She was completely cut off. She was no longer my beloved daughter. She was simply acceptable collateral damage in the total war she had foolishly helped start. Less than 10 minutes later, the phone rang in my hand. It was Jonathan. His voice was sharp-clipped and filled with a dark, professional satisfaction. The board is officially set. Over the secure line. I just received the final confirmation from our newly acquired debt collection teams. I authorized the Macau syndicate operatives, who now work legally under our corporate umbrella, to pay a very personal daytime visit to your arrogant new son-in-law. I looked down at the dark smoke rising slowly from the hot fire pit. "Tell me exactly what happened," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. Jonathan chuckled softly, a sound devoid of any real humor. Bradley Kensington was enjoying a lavish private lunch on the beautiful outdoor terrace of his exclusive country club, he explained. He was drinking incredibly expensive imported champagne and laughing loudly with his wealthy golf friends. Then 3 large men wearing dark tailored suits walked right past the intimidated country club security guards and stepped onto the private terrace. They walked directly over to Bradley's table and sat down in the empty chairs right across from him. They did not say a single word. They just sat there perfectly still, staring holes through him, while they casually drank his expensive scotch on your dime. I pictured Bradley's arrogant face suddenly draining of all its color. "Go on," I said. One of our operatives casually reached into his jacket and placed a folded photocopy of Bradley's $500,000 gambling marker directly on the glass table. Jonathan continued. Bradley recognized the men immediately. He dropped his crystal champagne glass, and it shattered all over the pristine stone terrace. Our men watched him completely and totally panic. He scrambled out of his chair and tried to run to his luxury sports car in the valet lot, but his hands were shaking so violently he dropped his keys on the manicured green grass. "The trap is closing on him right now, Bill. He knows the dangerous syndicate has found him in broad daylight, and he knows they want their massive debt paid today. He is completely terrified." I listened to Jonathan's detailed report and felt a deep, overwhelming sense of absolute peace settle into my bones. Bradley Kensington, the arrogant little boy who had laughed in my face and shamelessly flaunted his $40,000 gold watch, was now literally running for his life across a suburban golf course. He thought he was completely untouchable. He thought stealing from a quiet old man was a simple, victimless crime. Now the terrifying and violent reality of his own reckless actions was staring him directly in the face, and he had absolutely no money left to save himself. "Keep the heavy pressure on him, Jonathan," ordered calmly. "Let him run. Let him panic. Let him slowly realize that there is absolutely nowhere left to hide in this entire city." I hung up the phone and walked away from the burning ashes of my past. I walked back inside my small, quiet house and locked the door behind me. I walked into my bedroom and looked at the immaculate $10,000 suit hanging perfectly on the closet door. Tomorrow night, Richard Kensington was hosting his grand corporate gala to celebrate his fake success. Tomorrow night, the fragile glass facade of their entire family would completely shatter into a million pieces. And I was going to be dressed perfectly for the execution. I drove my rusted 2004 pickup truck into the heart of the downtown financial district. The heavy tires rumbled over the smooth asphalt as I navigated through the labyrinth of towering glass skyscrapers. The city was alive with weekend energy, but inside the cab of my truck, the atmosphere was as cold and silent as a tomb. I was wearing my bespoke $10,000 midnight blue suit. The heavy charcoal wool felt like a suit of armor against my skin. For the past decade, I had driven these exact same streets wearing stained denim and faded flannel, hiding my massive wealth behind the mask of a tired blue-collar worker. Tonight, the mask was entirely gone. Tonight, I was driving directly to the 40-story headquarters of Kensington Global. I was driving to the very building that I secretly owned. I pulled onto the grand avenue leading up to the main entrance of the massive glass tower. The entire street had been aggressively blocked off by private security teams and heavy velvet ropes. A long line of imported luxury sedans, sleek European sports cars, and stretched black limousines waited patiently for the valet service. I did not wait in the back of the line. I pulled my battered, rusted truck directly to the front, cutting off a brand-new silver Mercedes. The young valet attendant, wearing a crisp red uniform, looked absolutely horrified. He stepped forward aggressively, waving his hands in the air, trying to shoo me away. He clearly thought I was a lost construction worker or a confused delivery driver who had accidentally wandered into a billionaire gathering. I put the truck in park and opened the heavy creaking metal door. I stepped out onto the pristine red carpet. The valet stopped dead in his tracks. He looked at the cracked windshield of my old truck, and then his eyes traveled down to my immaculate custom tailoring. The midnight blue fabric caught the bright streetlights with a rich, heavy luster that screamed absolute power and unlimited wealth. The sheer contrast completely paralyzed him. He stood there with his mouth slightly open, unsure of what to do. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the keys to the truck, and wrapped them in a crisp $100 bill. I handed the small bundle to the stunned young man. "Keep it parked close to the front," I told him, my voice steady and commanding. "I will not be staying very long tonight." The valet nodded dumbly, gripping the money, and climbed up into the torn leather driver's seat of my truck. I turned my back on him and walked slowly up the massive red carpet. Bright flashes of light erupted from the sides of the walkway as hired photographers aggressively snapped pictures of the arriving corporate executives. None of them knew who I was. To them, I was just another wealthy titan of industry arriving to celebrate Richard Kensington's supposed massive corporate success. They had absolutely no idea that I was the man holding the legal matches ready to burn the entire event to the ground. I approached the towering double-glass doors that led into the main atrium. A team of 4 massive private security guards stood like stone statues behind a thick, braided velvet rope. They were dressed in sharp black suits with clear earpieces coiled around their necks. They were meticulously checking names on a glowing digital tablet before allowing anyone inside. These were men hired specifically to keep the unwanted and the uninvited far away from the elite high society guests. I stepped directly up to the velvet rope. The head of security, a broad-shouldered man with a thick neck and cold eyes, held up a massive, heavy hand to stop my forward momentum. "Good evening, sir," the security chief said, his eyes scanning the expensive cut of my suit. "May I please have your last name for the VIP guest list?" I looked directly into his eyes without blinking. "Dalton," I replied smoothly. "William Dalton." The massive man scrolled a thick finger down the glowing screen of his digital tablet. He frowned slightly. He scrolled back up to the top of the list and checked again. He let out a short professional sigh. "I am incredibly sorry, Mr. Dalton, but your name is absolutely not on the approved executive guest list tonight. This is a highly exclusive private corporate celebration. I will have to ask you to please step aside immediately so the invited guests can pass through the doors." I did not move a single muscle. I stood my ground on the red carpet. 2 of the other large security guards immediately stepped forward, crossing their thick arms over their chests. They were aggressively closing the physical distance, preparing to physically remove me if I decided to cause a scene. Just a few short days ago, at my daughter's wedding reception, I had been verbally abused and intimidated by arrogant men exactly like this. I had allowed myself to be bullied and pushed into a dark corner. Tonight, I felt absolutely nothing but cold, untouchable power. I did not raise my voice to argue. I did not show a single ounce of panic or anger. I slowly reached my right hand inside the breast pocket of my tailored jacket. The 3 guards tensed up immediately, expecting me to pull out a weapon or perhaps a massive bribe. Instead, I pulled out a single, neatly folded piece of heavy legal paper. It was not a weapon, but in this specific environment, it was something infinitely more dangerous. I unfolded the crisp document and handed it calmly over the velvet rope directly to the head of security. I highly suggest you read that document very carefully before you decide to put your hands on me or tell me where I am allowed to stand, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously low pitch. The massive security chief took the paper from my hand. He looked deeply annoyed at first, clearly thinking I was handing him a fake invitation or a useless business card. But then his eyes scanned the bold black text printed across the top of the page. Certified Deed of Commercial Property Ownership. He read the exact address listed on the document. It was the absolute precise address of the 40-story skyscraper we were currently standing in front of. He read the name of the parent holding company, Apex Holdings. And finally, his eyes slowly dragged down to the bottom of the page, where he read the name of the sole authorized executor and absolute owner of that holding company, William Dalton. The head of security slowly looked up from the heavy paper. All the blood had completely drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and terrified. He looked at my calm, unblinking eyes, and the devastating reality of the situation crashed down upon him. He realized that he was actively attempting to throw the supreme legal landlord of the entire building out onto the street. He realized that the quiet man standing in front of him possessed the absolute legal authority to fire his entire security firm, cancel the massive corporate event inside, and lock the glass doors of the building forever with a single phone call. "Sir," the security chief stammered, his voice completely cracking, as he handed the heavy document back to me with violently trembling fingers. "I am so incredibly sorry, Mr. Dalton. Please forgive the total misunderstanding. We had absolutely no idea who you were." He turned violently to his men and aggressively gestured for them to drop the velvet barrier. "Step aside right now," he barked at the confused guards. "Open the main doors immediately." The other guards scrambled in a pure panic to unhook the heavy red rope. They pulled the towering glass doors wide open, bowing their heads slightly. To my schwa out of my way, I took my legal deed, folded it neatly along the creases, and slipped it safely back into my inside jacket pocket. I did not thank them for their compliance. I simply walked straight past them, leaving the cold night air behind, and stepped directly into the grand marble foyer of my own massive building. The inside of the corporate headquarters was absolutely spectacular. The Kensington Global Gala was taking place in the massive open glass atrium on the ground floor. The sheer amount of money Richard had wasted on this illusion was staggering. Hundreds of wealthy investors, influential politicians, and high society elites were happily mingling under towering exotic floral arrangements and massive crystal chandeliers. Waiters in white coats carried silver trays loaded with incredibly expensive champagne and imported caviar. Soft classical music echoed off the polished marble walls. It was a perfect, flawless picture of absolute corporate royalty and untouched wealth. I stayed in the dark shadows near the back of the massive room, leaning against a cold marble pillar. I quietly observed the fake empire I was about to completely and ruthlessly destroy. I saw wealthy men laughing and shaking hands, completely unaware that the ground they were standing on was about to completely collapse. Suddenly, the soft classical music faded away. The bright ambient lights in the massive glass atrium slowly dimmed down to absolute darkness. A single blindingly bright white spotlight cut through the shadows, illuminating a grand stage set up at the far end of the room. The crowd fell completely silent and began to applaud respectfully. Richard Kensington stepped proudly into the bright light. He was wearing a flawless custom tuxedo and a blindingly arrogant smile. He walked confidently up to the crystal podium, soaking in the applause of the wealthy elite. He looked out over the sea of faces, entirely ready to announce his fake corporate merger and officially celebrate his untouchable financial salvation. He was completely and totally unaware that the executioner had just entered the room and the trap was about to aggressively snap shut. Richard stood at the crystal podium, basking in the warm glow of the bright white spotlight. He raised a tall glass of golden champagne high into the air. The soft murmurs of the wealthy crowd instantly quieted down. He looked out over the massive sea of influential investors and powerful politicians with a smile that was completely sickening in its absolute arrogance. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Richard said, his voice booming proudly through the massive speakers. "We are gathered here not just to celebrate the end of a highly successful fiscal year, but to ring in a brand new era for Kensington Global. As you all know, the corporate logistics industry is a brutal and unforgiving battlefield. Only the absolute strongest and the most visionary survive. And tonight, I stand before you to officially announce that our beautiful empire is completely impenetrable." The wealthy crowd erupted into polite, elegant applause. I stood in the dark shadows at the very back of the room, silently watching him feed his massive, fragile ego. "We have just secured the absolute future of this company," Richard continued, his chest puffed out with false pride. "With our brand new 10-year lease on this magnificent corporate headquarters and our upcoming lucrative merger, we are building a permanent legacy that will last for generations. We are completely untouchable. We are the kings of this city. So please raise your glasses to Kensington Global and to the absolute power of our family." The elite guests raised their crystal glasses in perfect unison. It was the exact perfect moment. His blinding pride had reached its absolute zenith. It was time for the devastating fall. I stepped out of the dark shadows and walked directly onto the polished marble floor of the center aisle. My footsteps were slow, deliberate, and completely silent on the expensive stone. I did not rush. I walked with the heavy, measured pace of a man who owned every single breath of air in that massive room. The air smelled of expensive perfume and roasted meats, but underneath it all, I could smell the absolute fragility of their fake world. As I moved through the crowd, people naturally stepped aside. They saw the heavy midnight blue fabric of my bespoke suit and felt the cold radiating power of my total presence. They did not know who I was, but they instinctively knew I was someone extremely dangerous. I remembered the last time I was in a room like this just a few days ago. I was shoved into a dark corner next to the noisy kitchen doors wearing a tight rented tuxedo. Tonight the sea of imported silk and expensive jewelry parted for me like the ocean. Richard was taking a deep, arrogant sip of his champagne when his eyes finally scanned the center aisle. He stopped mid-sip. He lowered his crystal glass slowly. He recognized my face, but his arrogant brain completely short-circuited, trying to process the impossible image standing right in front of him. He was frantically trying to figure out why the broke old blue-collar mechanic from his son's wedding was currently wearing a $10,000 suit and walking toward his grand stage like a conquering emperor. The polite applause completely died down into a confused, heavy silence as the elite guests noticed Richard staring, wide-eyed, at the center of the room. "What is the exact meaning of this?" Richard demanded loudly, his voice echoing awkwardly through the microphone. He pointed a violently shaking finger directly at my chest. "How did you get in here, Dalton?" The entire room of 900 powerful guests turned in absolute unison to look at me. I did not stop walking. I kept my eyes locked completely on his panicking, sweating face. "Security!" Richard barked, his voice rising in pitch as absolute panic began to violently crack his confident facade. "Where is my private security team? I want this man removed immediately. He is a trespasser. He is absolute trash. Drag him out of my building right now and throw him into the street." From the side of the grand ballroom, the massive head of security stepped forward into the bright light. He was flanked by 4 of his largest guards. Richard smiled a cruel, desperate smile, fully expecting them to rush forward and violently tackle me to the hard marble floor. He desperately wanted to see me humiliated again. Instead, the security chief stopped right at the edge of the stage. He looked up at Richard, and then he looked respectfully over at me. He completely crossed his arms over his broad chest and firmly planted his feet into the floor. He slowly shook his head in absolute defiance. "We cannot do that, Mr. Kensington," the security chief said, his deep voice projecting clearly into the silent, confused room. Richard slammed his fist onto the crystal podium, causing his tall champagne glass to violently tip over and spill sticky liquid all across his pristine speech notes. "What do you mean you cannot do that?" Richard screamed, his face turning a dark, dangerous shade of furious red. "I pay your massive salary. I am ordering you to throw this garbage out." The security chief did not flinch or break eye contact. "You do not pay my salary anymore, Mr. Kensington," the large man replied calmly. "And I highly suggest you lower your voice immediately. You are speaking to the absolute legal owner of this entire property." A collective shocked gasp rippled through the massive crowd of wealthy investors. Richard stumbled backward as if he had just been physically punched hard in the chest. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but absolutely no words came out. I reached the front of the room and slowly walked up the carpeted steps of the grand stage. Richard was completely paralyzed with total shock. He watched me approach with wide, terrified eyes. I walked directly up to him and calmly pulled the microphone right out of his trembling, sweating hand. I turned to face the massive crowd. 900 of the most powerful people in the city were staring at me in absolute stunned silence, waiting for an explanation. "Good evening," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly steady, echoing off the towering glass walls. "My name is William Dalton. Richard just told you all that he secured a 10-year lease for this magnificent building to cement his impenetrable empire." I reached into my pocket and pressed a small button on my secure encrypted phone. High up in the technical booth, Jonathan Reed immediately executed my exact pre-planned orders. The massive digital screen behind the stage, which had been proudly displaying the Kensington Global corporate logo, suddenly flickered and completely changed. A massive high-definition image of a certified legal deed appeared on the screen, towering 30 feet high for every single person in the room to read clearly. I pointed to the massive glowing screen. What Richard completely failed to mention to his board members and his trusted investors is that he never actually secured that lease, I announced loudly. Because my holding company, Apex Holdings, owns this entire skyscraper. And yesterday afternoon, I officially denied his lease renewal and signed a 24-hour commercial eviction notice. The ballroom instantly erupted into a chaotic symphony of shocked murmurs and panicked whispers. Wealthy investors began pulling out their phones, frantically checking their corporate stock portfolios and rapidly texting their financial brokers. Richard stood completely frozen behind me, sweating profusely and quietly gasping for air. "But Richard did not just lie to you about the building." I continued, my voice slicing through the rising panic in the room like a sharp razor blade. "He told you his logistics company was financially untouchable. He told you a lucrative new merger was going to completely save all of your massive investments." I pressed the button on my phone a second time. The image on the massive screen shifted again. This time it displayed a comprehensive financial ledger heavily stamped with official federal banking seals. It clearly showed the $15 million in toxic corporate debt that Kensington Global owed to various banks. And right below that massive red number, it clearly showed the name of the solitary entity that had just purchased every single penny of that crippling debt. Apex Holdings. "Look very closely at the screen," I commanded the angry crowd. "Kensington Global is completely and totally insolvent. They are entirely out of cash. They have been surviving on fraudulent accounting and desperate lies for over 6 months. And as of yesterday morning, my company officially bought every single outstanding loan, every commercial credit line, and every massive corporate debt this man owes to the world." I turned around and looked directly at Richard. He looked exactly like a deflated balloon. The custom silk tuxedo suddenly looked 3 sizes too big for his shrinking, cowardly frame. The arrogant titan of industry was completely gone, leaving only a terrified, pathetic fraud shivering under the bright stage lights. "You do not have an empire, Richard," I said quietly, but the microphone picked up every single cold, heavy syllable. "You do not have a legacy. You do not even have a desk to sit at tomorrow morning." The powerful investors in the room were no longer whispering. They were staring at Richard with absolute murderous fury. These were ruthless businessmen who had just realized they had been completely conned by a desperate liar. They realized that Richard Kensington did not own the massive building he was standing in. He did not own the corporate assets he had repeatedly promised them. He did not even own his own massive financial debt. I owned his debt. I owned his building. I completely owned Richard. And as the terrifying reality of his absolute financial ruin washed over the wealthy crowd, a new chaotic commotion suddenly erupted near the heavy glass doors at the back of the grand ballroom. The complete and total execution of the Kensington family was only just beginning. I stood on the center of the grand stage, looking down at Richard. The heavy silence in the room had completely shattered violently, replaced by the aggressive shouting of enraged investors. They were demanding their money back. They were screaming about federal lawsuits. But I simply held the microphone close to my mouth and spoke over the chaotic noise. My voice was calm, cold, and completely unwavering. "You have exactly 24 hours, Richard Thurs," announced, projecting every word clearly into the cavernous room. "By 8 o'clock tomorrow evening, my private security teams will permanently lock the heavy glass doors of this skyscraper. Every single desk, every computer, and every file cabinet in this building currently belongs to Apex Holdings as collateral against your massive defaulted debt. You are allowed to take the clothes on your back and the personal photographs on your desk. Everything else is mine." Richard stared at me with completely bloodshot eyes. His chest heaved violently under his expensive silk tuxedo. He looked out at the sea of angry faces in the crowd. He saw the wealthy politicians he had bribed turning their backs. He saw his elite board members aggressively texting their legal teams, preparing to throw him to the wolves. His entire kingdom, the empire he had built on a foundation of pure arrogance and stolen money, was completely vaporizing before his very eyes. The absolute humiliation of being publicly dismantled by the man he had thrown out of his son's wedding was finally breaking his mind. "You did this to me," Richard screamed, his voice cracking with pure hysterical rage. He completely lost whatever tiny shred of sanity he had left. "You ruined my family, Dalton. You are a dead man." Richard lowered his head and aggressively lunged forward. He threw his entire body weight toward me, swinging his heavy fists in a desperate attempt to physically destroy the man who had just erased his existence. I did not step back. I did not flinch or raise my hands to protect my face. I simply stood my ground in my bespoke blue suit, completely unafraid of a broken coward. Before Richard could even close the short distance between us, a massive force suddenly hit him from the side. 3 men, wearing dark tactical windbreakers with bright yellow federal letters printed across the back, violently tackled him to the polished wooden floor of the stage. The heavy thud of his body hitting the ground echoed loudly through the ballroom speakers. From the dark shadows on the left side of the grand stage, Jonathan Reed calmly walked out into the bright white spotlight. He was carrying his sleek leather briefcase and adjusting his expensive silk tie. He looked down at Richard, who was currently pinned face down against the floor mopped by the federal marshals. "You are a very difficult man to serve papers to, Mr. Kensington," Jonathan said, his voice dripping with absolute professional disdain. "But I thought this grand celebration would be the perfect venue to deliver the final blow." The federal marshals aggressively pulled Richard's arms behind his back and secured heavy steel handcuffs tightly around his wrists. The sharp metallic click of the cuffs locking into place was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. Richard groaned in pain, struggling weakly against the overwhelming force of the federal agents. Jonathan unclasped his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal warrants. He turned to address the shocked and silent crowd of wealthy investors. "My name is Jonathan Reed," he announced clearly. "I am the senior legal counsel for Apex Holdings. The men currently holding Richard Kensington are federal agents from the Financial Crimes Division. We have spent the last 48 hours handing over mountains of irrefutable digital evidence proving that Mr. Kensington has been actively committing massive corporate fraud for over 5 years. He has embezzled millions of dollars from your own employee pension funds and forged commercial documents to secure illegal high-interest loans. He is not just completely bankrupt. He is a massive federal criminal. The investors in the room gasped in total horror. The angry shouting completely stopped, replaced by the terrifying realization of absolute financial ruin. Several executives in the front row immediately pulled out their glowing smartphones and frantically opened their live stock trading applications. I watched their faces turn completely white. The financial news networks had just broken the story of the federal raid and the massive corporate debt default. Kensington Global was a publicly traded company that relied entirely on investor confidence. With the chief executive officer handcuffed on stage and the corporate headquarters officially seized by my holding company, that confidence completely evaporated in a matter of seconds. "Look at your screens," I told the crowd, my voice echoing through the massive room. "Look at the legacy this man built." The stock price of Kensington Global, which had been hovering at a respectable $80 a share that very morning, began to violently plummet in real time. It dropped to $40, then 20, then 10. Panic selling flooded the global market. Within 3 short minutes, the stock completely flatlined at exactly $0.00. The company was officially completely worthless. Richard was violently hauled to his feet by the federal marshals. His expensive custom tuxedo was heavily wrinkled and covered in dust from the stage floor. His slick hair hung in sweaty strands across his forehead. He looked absolutely pathetic. He looked like a man who finally realized that he was going to spend the rest of his miserable life locked inside a tiny concrete cell. "Take him away," Jonathan ordered, waving his hand dismissively. "He is ruining the aesthetic of my client's building." It was the exact same cruel phrase Richard had used against me at the wedding reception just a few days ago. Hearing it repeated back to him in front of his wealthy peers was the absolute final nail in his coffin. Richard did not fight back anymore. He hung his head in total defeat, sobbing quietly, as the federal agents dragged him down the stage stairs and marched him straight down the center aisle. The crowd of elite guests immediately parted for him, but this time they were not bowing in respect. They were backing away in total disgust, treating him exactly like the toxic garbage he truly was. I stood on the stage and watched the heavy glass doors close behind him. The architect of my public humiliation was completely gone. But my work was not entirely finished. The father had just paid for his blinding arrogance, but the son still needed to answer for his massive theft. The grand ballroom was in a state of absolute chaos. Investors were screaming into their cell phones, running desperately toward the exits to call their financial advisors. Women in expensive silk gowns were nervously gathering their imported purses, eager to escape the massive crime scene. I stood perfectly still on the elevated stage, letting my cold eyes slowly scan the rapidly moving crowd. I was looking for one specific rat trying to flee the sinking ship. I found him near the back service exit. Bradley Kensington was completely drenched in nervous sweat. He had watched his untouchable father get dragged away in heavy steel handcuffs. He had watched his family fortune completely evaporate into thin air. And he knew exactly what was coming for him next. The violent loan sharks from the Macau syndicate were already actively hunting him across the city, and now his only source of protective wealth was entirely gone. He was trying to quietly slip through the swinging wooden doors that led to the catering kitchen, hoping to disappear into the dark city streets before I noticed him. He was trying to run away, just like he always did whenever his massive gambling debts caught up with him. I raised the heavy microphone to my mouth. "Bradley Kensington." I called out, my voice booming like thunder across the chaotic room. Bradley completely froze. He was standing exactly where I had been sitting at his wedding reception. He was standing right next to the dark corner table where his father had thrown freezing ice water into my face. He slowly turned around, his face completely pale and his eyes wide with absolute terror. "Do not try to walk out that back door, Bradley," I said loudly, ensuring that every single remaining person in the grand ballroom could hear my words. "You and I have some very serious unfinished business to discuss. Let us talk about the $100,000 you and my daughter stole from me. And let us talk about the men waiting outside for you right now." Bradley stood completely frozen by the heavy wooden service doors. The remaining crowd in the grand ballroom turned their attention away from the empty stage and focused entirely on the terrified young man in the designer tuxedo. I walked slowly down the carpeted stairs of the stage and moved down the center aisle toward him. Every single step I took echoed in the cavernous space. The federal marshals who had just dragged his father away were still standing near the entrance, blocking the main exits. Bradley was trapped like a rat in a glass cage. I stopped 10 feet away from him. He was sweating so heavily that his expensive silk collar was completely soaked. He looked at me not with the arrogant sneer he had worn yesterday morning, but with the wide, terrified eyes of a child who had just been caught stealing. "You thought you could just walk out the back door, Bradley," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the silent room. "You thought you could watch your father take the fall for his massive corporate fraud and quietly slip away into the night. But you and I both know that your father is not the only criminal in your family." Bradley swallowed hard. His eyes darted nervously toward the service doors and then back to the federal agents. "Bill, please," he whispered, his voice trembling so violently I could barely hear him. "Please do not do this right now. We can handle this privately." I shook my head slowly. "We are far past handling anything privately," I replied. "You completely lost the right to privacy the moment you publicly humiliated me at your wedding. And you lost your right to mercy the moment you decided to steal my life savings to pay off your violent underground debts." The wealthy guests who had stayed behind began to murmur again. I turned slightly to address the crowd, ensuring they heard every single word of his absolute destruction. 2 nights ago, I announced loudly, my daughter and this man completely drained my civilian bank account. They forged my signature on a joint account withdrawal slip and committed massive federal wire fraud. They stole $100,000 from the man they thought was a struggling blue-collar worker. They thought they were taking my absolute last dime. And why did they steal it? Because Bradley Kensington has a crippling gambling addiction, and he owed a massive debt to a violent international loan shark syndicate operating out of Macau. Bradley closed his eyes and let out a pathetic whimper. He knew his entire high society reputation was completely disintegrating in real time. But that $100,000 was just a tiny drop in the bucket. I continued stepping closer to him. "You still owed them $500,000, Bradley. And this afternoon, while you were drinking expensive champagne at your exclusive country club, 3 men from that syndicate sat down at your table. They showed you the debt markers. They told you the money was due today." Bradley's knees physically buckled. He stumbled backward and hit the heavy wooden service doors, sliding down slightly until he caught his balance. "How do you know about the country club?" he gasped, his face completely pale. I smiled a cold, unforgiving smile. "Because I am the man who sent them," I said. "Yesterday afternoon, my holding company completely purchased your illicit gambling debt. I bought your life, Bradley. Those dangerous men work directly for me now. You do not owe the Macau syndicate anymore. You owe William Dalton. And I am calling in the entire massive debt right here and right now." The absolute terror on his face was a magnificent sight to behold. He realized that the father-in-law he had ruthlessly mocked was now the supreme master of his total destruction. He had absolutely no money left. His father's fake empire was completely gone. He was entirely at my mercy, and he knew I had absolutely none left to give. Before Bradley could even formulate a pathetic apology, a sudden violent commotion erupted from the opposite side of the ballroom. "Leave him alone!" a shrill, desperate voice screamed over the crowd. I turned my head. Sarah was aggressively pushing her way through the crowd of shocked executives. She was wearing a stunning custom silk evening gown, that probably cost more than my first truck. Her face was completely red with fury, and her eyes were filled with hot tears. She shoved past a wealthy investor and ran directly toward Bradley, standing protectively in front of him. She glared at me with absolute blinding hatred. She did not look at me like I was her father. She looked at me like I was a monster who was completely ruining her perfect fairy tale life. "Stop doing this, Dad!" Sarah screamed at the top of her lungs, pointing an accusing finger directly at my face. "Stop trying to destroy my husband. You are just completely bitter and jealous because Richard threw water in your face. You are doing all of this just to punish us for moving on to a better life." I looked at my only daughter. The absolute magnitude of her delusion was staggering. She was standing in the ruins of a massive federal fraud raid defending a man who had just stolen her father's money, and she was still trying to blame me for her misery. "I am not destroying your husband, Sarah," I said, keeping my voice incredibly calm. "He destroyed himself. He is a gambling addict who dragged you into a massive federal crime. You committed wire fraud for this man. You forged my signature to pay off violent criminals." Sarah crossed her arms defiantly, completely refusing to accept reality. "We just needed a little bit of help," she yelled, crying hysterically. "Brad is a good man. He just made a few bad investments. He loves me. We used your money because we are building a massive future together, and you were never going to use it anyway. You just sit in your tiny house doing nothing. Brad is going to pay you back as soon as his new corporate deal goes through. He loves me and we are a team." I stared at her for a long, silent moment. I felt a deep, profound sadness completely wash over me. I realized that my daughter was not just greedy. She was incredibly foolish. She truly believed that Bradley loved her. She actually thought she was an equal partner in this wealthy family. "Sarah," I said softly, "he does not love you. He never loved you." "Yes, he does," she screamed back, stamping her expensive heel on the marble floor. "You know absolutely nothing about our relationship. You know nothing about love. You are just a cold, bitter old man trying to ruin the only good thing that has ever happened to me." I reached slowly into the inside pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I pulled out the sleek black encrypted burner phone. I had planned to use this only if absolutely necessary to break her final delusion. And standing here listening to her violently defend the parasite who was using her as a human shield, I knew it was time to cut the absolute final cord. I did not argue with her anymore. I simply unlocked the phone and opened the high-definition audio file I had recorded in the Kensington mansion yesterday morning. I held the phone up to the microphone I was still holding in my left hand. I pressed play. The crystal-clear audio echoed violently through the massive ballroom speakers. Every single person in the room heard Bradley's arrogant, cruel voice perfectly. "That is a very beautiful watch, Bradley," my recorded voice asked, submissively. "Did you buy that with the $100,000 you and Sarah took from my bank account last night?" Then the sound of Bradley's cruel, echoing laughter filled the room. "It is a wedding gift to myself, old man," his recorded voice bragged with absolute arrogance. "And you should consider it an investment in your daughter's future. She belongs to the Kensington family now, which means your pathetic life savings finally served a real purpose." Sarah completely froze. The furious, angry expression on her face instantly melted into total shock. She slowly turned her head and looked back at Bradley. He was staring in absolute horror at the phone in my hand. The recording continued to play loudly over the speakers. Sarah forged my signature. "Bradley," my voice said on the tape, "that is federal wire fraud. Why did you make her do that to her own father? Why did you steal everything I had left in the world?" Then came the absolute devastating kill shot. Bradley's recorded voice, completely relaxed and completely merciless, echoed through the grand atrium. "I did not make her do anything, Dalton," he bragged. "Sarah is a smart girl, but she is a completely gullible pawn. I only married her because I knew you had that retirement money sitting around, and I needed liquid cash to get the syndicate off my back." She did the creative accounting, she signed the withdrawal slip, and the money vanished. I used her to get to your money. She actually thinks we are building a life together. You are never seeing a single dime of it again. I pressed the stop button on the phone. The heavy silence that followed was completely suffocating. I lowered the phone and looked directly at Sarah. The bright, arrogant fire in her eyes was completely extinguished. All the color had drained from her beautiful face. Her lips were trembling violently. She realized in one single devastating moment that her entire marriage, her grand social elevation, and her supposed true love were all completely fake. She had thrown away her devoted father and committed a massive federal crime for a man who openly considered her a gullible pawn and a human bank account. She slowly turned to face Bradley. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably. "Brad," she whispered, her voice completely broken. "Tell me that is not true. Tell me you did not just marry me for his money." Bradley did not look at her with love. He did not look at her with remorse. He looked at her like a wild, trapped animal looking for a distraction. He knew the federal marshals blocking the main exits had heard the recorded confession. He knew the syndicate men were waiting for him outside the building. He was completely out of time and completely out of options. The heavy glass doors at the front of the ballroom suddenly burst open. 3 men wearing dark, tailored suits walked into the massive atrium. They were the operatives from the Macau syndicate, the men I now completely controlled. They spotted Bradley near the back service exit and immediately began walking toward him with dark, violent intent. Bradley's eyes widened in total, absolute panic. He saw the dangerous men approaching. He saw the federal agents moving in from the sides. Sarah cried out, reaching out to grab his expensive suit jacket. "Please tell me you love me." Bradley looked at the woman who had just sacrificed her entire life for him. He did not hesitate for a single second. He raised his hands, shoved Sarah violently in the chest, and threw her completely out of his way. Sarah gasped in pain as she fell hard onto the polished marble floor, tearing her expensive silk gown and scraping her knees. Bradley did not even look down at her. He completely abandoned his wife, scrambling desperately toward the heavy wooden service doors. He pushed through the swinging doors and ran blindly into the dark alleyway behind the massive skyscraper. He left her completely alone on the cold, hard floor of the grand ballroom. The wealthy elite guests stared down at her with absolute pity and disgust. The police sirens began to wail loudly in the distance, rapidly approaching the corporate headquarters. The massive web had completely closed. The Kensington family was utterly destroyed. And my daughter was left sitting in the ruins of her own blinding greed, weeping uncontrollably as the federal agents slowly swarmed into the room to arrest her. It was exactly 1 week later. The chaotic dust of the massive corporate execution had finally settled, leaving nothing but the completely ruined ashes of the Kensington family empire. I was no longer living in the small, cramped suburban house with the cracked concrete driveway. That house was a disguise I no longer needed to wear. I had officially moved into the primary residence of the Apex Holdings Private Trust. It was a sprawling 200-acre secluded estate located deep in the lush green hills outside the city. The main house was a massive architectural masterpiece constructed from imported white stone and dark, heavy timber. It was surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens, towering oak trees, and a massive private security wall. For the first time in 10 long years, I was finally living in the absolute reality of my own immense wealth. I sat on the wide stone terrace overlooking a pristine private lake. The morning air was incredibly crisp and clean. I held a warm cup of black coffee and read the morning financial newspapers. The front pages were completely dominated by the spectacular downfall of Richard Kensington. The federal justice system had moved with absolute ruthless efficiency. 2 days ago, Richard was hauled into a federal courthouse wearing a bright orange prison jumpsuit. His expensive corporate defense attorneys had completely abandoned him the exact moment they realized his bank accounts were entirely frozen by my legal team. He was assigned an exhausted, court-appointed lawyer who could do absolutely nothing to save him. The federal judge took one single look at the massive mountain of irrefutable digital evidence Jonathan had provided and completely denied Richard's request for bail. He deemed the disgraced chief executive a massive flight risk. Richard was currently locked inside a tiny cold concrete cell in the federal penitentiary, waiting for a criminal trial that would undoubtedly put him behind bars for the rest of his miserable natural life. Kensington Global was completely dissolved, and its assets were actively being liquidated by my holding company. And Bradley Kensington had proven himself to be the ultimate pathetic coward. The exact moment he ran out the back doors of the grand ballroom, leaving his new wife crying on the marble floor, he vanished entirely. He knew the dangerous operatives from the Macau syndicate were actively hunting him, and he knew the Federal Financial Crimes Division was right behind them. He stole a luxury sports car from the valet lot and drove recklessly across state lines, abandoning his entire life. He left Sarah completely alone to face the devastating legal and financial consequences of the massive federal wire fraud they had committed together. The heavy intercom sitting on my outdoor stone table suddenly buzzed, breaking the absolute morning silence. It was the commander of my private security detail stationed at the massive iron gates 2 miles down the private road. He informed me that a young woman was standing outside the gates frantically begging to be let inside. I pressed a button on my digital tablet and pulled up the high-definition live feed from the front gate security cameras. It was Sarah. The transformation was completely staggering. She was no longer the arrogant, entitled high society princess who had cruelly demanded $50,000 for a luxury vacation to Dubai. She was wearing a pair of dirty gray sweatpants and a faded oversized sweater. Her expensive hair extensions were tangled and completely unkempt. Her face was pale, exhausted, and heavily stained with dark streaks of ruined makeup. She looked exactly like a desperate, terrified fugitive who had not slept in days. "Open the main gates," I told my security chief through the intercom. "Let her walk through, but do not offer her a ride in the security vehicles. Make her walk the entire 2 miles up the main driveway." I sat calmly on the stone terrace and watched the security monitors as my daughter slowly trudged up the long, winding paved road. The steep incline and the physical exhaustion clearly took a massive toll on her. It took her nearly 45 minutes to reach the main house. By the time she finally walked up the grand stone steps and stepped onto the wide terrace, she was completely out of breath and physically shaking. She stopped dead in her tracks when she reached the edge of the patio. Her wide, terrified eyes slowly took in the sheer, massive scale of the billionaire estate. She saw the towering stone columns, the cascading water features, and the pristine fleet of imported luxury vehicles parked quietly in the circular motor court. The absolute, undeniable reality of my hidden empire finally crashed down upon her. She realized in that exact moment that the wealth she had desperately chased by marrying into the fraudulent Kensington family was absolutely pathetic compared to the true immense power sitting calmly right in front of her. "Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking violently with pure exhaustion and overwhelming regret. "I have been trying to find you all week. I went to the old house, but it was completely empty. The neighbors said you packed up and left in the middle of the night. I had to illegally access the Apex Holdings corporate registry just to find this private address." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee. I did not stand up to greet her. I did not offer her a comfortable chair or a glass of water. I simply looked at her with cold, detached eyes. "State your business, Sarah," I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of any paternal warmth. She fell forward, dropping heavily to her knees on the hard stone patio. She covered her face with her trembling hands and began to weep hysterically. The sound of her crying echoed loudly across the quiet estate. "Brad left me," she wailed, her shoulders shaking violently. "He completely abandoned me at the gala and disappeared. The federal police came to my house yesterday morning. They kicked down the front door and confiscated all of my computers, my cell phone, and my personal financial records. The bank officially foreclosed on the mansion and evicted me because you canceled the premium mortgage. I have absolutely nowhere to go and absolutely no money left to my name. The federal agents explicitly told me I am going to be officially indicted for massive wire fraud by the end of the week. My friends from the country club completely blocked my phone number. Everyone abandoned me. You have to help me, Dad. You have to hire the most expensive corporate lawyers in the city to keep me out of federal prison. Please just let me move into this massive house. There are so many empty rooms here. I can hide safely behind your security walls until the media completely forgets about the scandal and the charges go away. I looked down at the weeping woman kneeling on my expensive stone floor. A week ago, seeing my only child in this much agonizing pain would have absolutely shattered my heart. I would have rushed forward, picked her up off the ground, and promised to use every single dollar I possessed to protect her from the cruel world. But the father who would have done that was completely dead. He died the exact second she turned her back on him, while freezing ice water dripped from his face. I reached into the breast pocket of my tailored jacket. I pulled out a small piece of cheap printed cardstock. I stood up from my chair, walked slowly over to her, and dropped the card directly onto the stone floor right in front of her knees. Sarah slowly lowered her hands and looked down at the card. It was not the sleek embossed gold business card of Jonathan Reed or any other high-powered expensive corporate defense attorney. It was a generic black and white printed contact card for the local county public defender office. "What is this?" she whispered, staring at the cheap paper in total, absolute horror. "That is the direct phone number for the overworked state lawyer who is going to represent you in federal court," I said, my voice slicing through the morning air like a cold steel blade. "You made a conscious, greedy decision to commit a massive federal crime to fund a completely fake luxury lifestyle. You actively chose to steal your father's life savings to protect a cowardly fraud. You watched an arrogant monster publicly humiliate me in front of 900 people, and you completely abandoned me just to save your own pathetic social status." Sarah looked up at me, her eyes wide with absolute blinding panic. She reached out and desperately grabbed the bottom edge of my expensive suit trousers. "Dad, please," she begged, sobbing uncontrollably. "I am your only daughter. I am your own flesh and blood. You cannot just leave me to go to a concrete prison cell. You have hundreds of millions of dollars. You own an entire global empire. You can easily make all of these federal charges completely go away with a single phone call. I am so incredibly sorry. I will do whatever you want." I looked down at her desperate, trembling hands gripping my dark wool trousers. I slowly reached down and firmly pried her fingers off my clothing, pushing her hands away. "I raised a daughter," I said, staring directly into her terrified, weeping eyes. "I raised a girl who understood the profound value of hard work and absolute loyalty. But looking at the greedy, lying thief sitting on my patio right now, I have absolutely no idea who you are. The daughter I raised would never have sold her soul and destroyed her family for a cheap gold watch and a fraudulent mansion. You are not my daughter anymore. You are simply a federal criminal looking for a wealthy bailout." I took a step backward, completely severing the absolute final tie between us. "Get off my property, Sarah," I commanded, my voice echoing with total, unquestionable authority. "And if you ever try to contact me or step foot near this estate ever again, I will have my armed security team immediately arrest you for criminal trespassing." I turned my back on her and walked calmly toward the main house. I opened the heavy soundproof glass doors and stepped inside my quiet, peaceful home. I closed the doors firmly behind me, completely shutting out the chaotic sounds of her desperate, hysterical sobbing. I did not look back. I walked directly into my private study and sat down at my massive mahogany desk. The violent storm of the Kensington family was finally completely over, but there was still one absolute final piece of business left to complete before I could truly embrace my new life. 6 months have passed since the night the Kensington Empire completely collapsed into dust. The transition from the bitter cold winter to the warm, bright spring brought a profound sense of absolute renewal to my massive private estate. I was sitting in a heavy wooden rocking chair on my expansive back porch, watching the morning sun slowly rise over the calm surface of my private lake. The morning air was incredibly peaceful and completely still. There were no loud arguments echoing through the hallways. There were no arrogant demands for expensive vacations or luxury cars. There were absolutely no toxic parasites pretending to be my family just to drain my bank accounts. I was completely alone on my 200-acre property, and for the very first time in over a decade, I was completely and totally free. I rested my warm cup of black coffee on the small wooden table next to me and picked up my glowing digital tablet. Jonathan, my trusted corporate attorney, sent me a detailed executive summary every single morning regarding the ongoing legal fallout of the Kensington family. I slowly scrolled through the final court reports from the federal justice system. The wheels of justice turned slowly, but they ground incredibly fine. Yesterday afternoon, a federal judge officially slammed the heavy wooden gavel down on Richard Kensington. He was found guilty on 34 separate counts of massive corporate fraud, severe embezzlement, and international financial tampering. The report detailed how Richard stood in the center of the federal courtroom, wearing a cheap, bright orange prison jumpsuit. He looked exactly like a broken, pathetic old man. All of his expensive, custom-tailored silk suits and his imported cologne were completely gone. He cried in front of the judge and desperately begged for mercy, claiming he was simply a victim of a hostile corporate takeover. The federal judge looked at the thousands of innocent lives Richard had completely ruined by stealing employee pension funds to support his lavish lifestyle. The judge looked at the massive mountain of irrefutable digital evidence my holding company had provided and completely denied his pathetic request. Richard was officially sentenced to 10 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. He traded his 40-story glass skyscraper and his crystal champagne flutes for a tiny concrete cell and a metal toilet. He would be nearly 80 years old by the time he ever breathed free air again. His fake legacy, his impenetrable empire, was entirely erased from the face of the earth. I scrolled down the glowing screen to the next section of the legal report. Bradley Kensington did not make it very far on his desperate run from the federal authorities and the violent underground syndicate. He managed to hide in cheap, dirty motels for a few short weeks, but a coward always eventually makes a stupid mistake. He was violently arrested by armed state troopers at a rundown gas station in rural Nevada. He was actively trying to use a stolen credit card to buy a cheap sandwich when the police tackled him to the dusty concrete. The police report noted that he wept uncontrollably in the back of the squad car. The federal authorities immediately extradited him back to our city. He was currently sitting in a cold county jail cell, completely terrified, waiting for his own massive federal fraud trial. The international loan sharks he owed $500,000 to were completely neutralized by my aggressive legal team, so his physical safety was no longer in jeopardy. But Bradley would still spend the absolute best years of his life locked inside a federal prison, wearing the same orange jumpsuit as his arrogant father. And then there was Sarah. I read the detailed update provided by the expensive private investigator I had hired strictly to monitor her legal compliance and her living situation. She managed to barely avoid serving actual federal prison time by fully cooperating with the authorities. She turned over every single piece of digital evidence against Bradley and Richard, detailing exactly how they forced her to commit the massive wire fraud. But her physical freedom came with a massive, suffocating price. The federal judge ordered her to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in strict financial restitution for her active role in stealing my money. She was completely stripped of her imported luxury cars, her custom designer clothes, and her elevated high society status. The bank had officially seized the massive luxury mansion she tried to buy with my forged signature. My private investigator reported that my daughter was currently living in a tiny, cramped apartment in the absolute worst and most dangerous part of the city. She had absolutely no college degree and a massive federal felony on her permanent public record. She was currently working grueling, exhausting night shifts as a waitress at a rundown 24-hour diner, just to scrape together enough tips to meet her monthly court-mandated payments. I pictured her standing under the flickering fluorescent lights of that greasy diner. I pictured her wiping down sticky tables and dealing with rude, aggressive customers at 3 in the morning. I pictured her looking down at her bare hands, where her expensive diamond wedding ring used to be, realizing that her perfect fairy tale life was nothing but a devastating nightmare. It was a massive, catastrophic fall from the imported silk and the crystal chandeliers she had violently thrown me away to keep. I set the digital tablet face down on the wooden table. I looked out over the calm water of my beautiful lake. I did not smile. There was absolutely no joy in my heart, seeing my own flesh and blood reduced to scrubbing tables in the middle of the night just to survive. I did not feel a rush of vindictive glee, but I did feel a deep, profound, and completely unshakable sense of absolute peace. The natural order of the universe had been completely restored. Toxic actions finally had real, devastating consequences. I had spent my entire life trying to softly shield Sarah from the harsh, brutal realities of the world. I had sacrificed my own happiness and lived like a ghost just to provide for her. And my endless, unconditional sacrifice had only turned her into a greedy, entitled monster who viewed me as a disposable bank account. The universe was now providing the harsh, brutal education I had completely failed to give her. She was finally learning the true value of a single dollar through her own blood, sweat, and tears. The heavy, soundproof glass door behind me slid open smoothly. Jonathan walked onto the sunlit porch carrying his familiar dark leather briefcase. He looked completely relaxed and genuinely happy, a stark contrast to the high-stress environment we used to operate in when we were dismantling the Kensington Empire. He walked over to my table and pulled out a thick stack of pristine legal documents. "Good morning, Bill," Jonathan said respectfully, placing a solid gold pen perfectly aligned next to the heavy papers. "I have the final restructuring documents for the Apex Holdings Primary Trust. Everything is set up exactly according to your specific and exact instructions." I picked up the heavy documents and carefully read through the executive summary on the first page. For years, I had hoarded my massive wealth in secret blind trusts, absolutely terrified that it would corrupt my family if they ever found out about it. Now that the camouflage was completely gone, I knew exactly what I needed to do with my massive financial empire. I was officially transferring 90% of my total net worth and all of my liquid corporate assets into a brand new charitable foundation. It was called the Dalton Educational Trust. It was a massive global scholarship fund designed specifically to provide full-ride university tuitions, generous living stipends, and zero-interest business grants to underprivileged, incredibly hard-working young students. I was giving my billions of dollars to the kids who worked 14-hour shifts just to help their parents pay the rent. I was giving it to the single mothers attending night school under flickering streetlights. I was giving my wealth to the young people who possessed genuine moral character and a desperate hunger to improve the world. I was giving my entire empire to the people who actually understood the profound value of hard work, because they had to bleed for every single opportunity they ever received. I was investing in the children who would never throw freezing water in an old man's face. I picked up the gold pen and signed my legal name at the very bottom of the heavy document. As the ink dried on the paper, I felt an incredible heavy weight completely lift off my broad shoulders. The burden of hiding, the burden of toxic family, the burden of unappreciated sacrifice was completely gone. I handed the paperwork back to Jonathan. "It is officially done, Jonathan," I said, my voice steady, clear, and completely full of purpose. "Make sure the first massive round of scholarships goes out before the fall semester begins. Find the kids who are completely invisible to the wealthy elites. Give them the absolute power to change their own lives." Jonathan smiled a genuine warm smile. He packed the signed documents safely into his leather briefcase and snapped the brass locks shut. "It is an absolute honor to work for you, Bill," he said quietly, before turning around and walking back into the quiet house. I sat alone on the massive porch and listened to the gentle morning breeze rustling through the towering green oak trees. I thought about the tight rented tuxedo, the freezing ice water, and the deafening mocking silence of that grand ballroom. I thought about the long, agonizing journey from a broken, defeated father to a silent, ruthless executioner. I took a deep, cleansing breath of the fresh air and realized the absolute most important truth of my entire life. Blood does not make a family. Respect does. True family is never defined by shared genetics or a shared last name. It is defined by mutual loyalty, unwavering appreciation, and a pure love that never treats you like a disposable resource. And sometimes the absolute only way to teach respect to the toxic people who abuse you is to step aside completely. Remove your protective hands and let them hit the absolute rock bottom they violently dug for themselves. Thank you so much for listening to my life story. If you found value in my journey, or if you have ever had to walk away from toxic people who completely underestimated your worth, please let me know by leaving a comment below. Tell me what city or country you are watching from right now. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another powerful life story. Your sweet support means the absolute world to me, and it helps me continue sharing these important lessons. On your screen right now, you will see 2 more incredible life stories that I highly recommend you watch next. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video.